Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I'm very delighted to have Professor Ian Walker with me here in the studio, although I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture in Queensland. And Professor Walker, whereabouts are you?
I'm in Wales in the United Kingdom, in Swansea, down in the south of the country.
I came across that, I think it's 2016 paper where you said people shouldn't smoke in a place or people shouldn't park in a place. I thought that was very interesting research. So that's where I first came across you. If you wouldn't mind just saying what you're a professor in and how you became interested in this area.
I'm a professor of psychology. Obviously, that naturally leads you towards looking at individual people and looking at how people's minds work, why they act the way they act, and all that kind of thing. I've been working in issues of transport, traffic, sustainable behaviour for 20 odd years now. It's been quite a long time, ever since I decided I'd use my research skills to look at cycling safety, and it all snowballed from there. I think what's interesting, just as an aside, is the more I work in this area, the more I'm interested in things that are beyond individual people. Because yes, we can get a long way by looking at what's going on in your mind, but your mind doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a society and a culture and a physical world. And the more I work in this area, the more important I see they are.
So is that moving into sociology or cultural studies, or what area would it be when you look at the effect of the larger culture on our individual behaviour?
Yeah, and I think all of those things you just mentioned have a role. So psychology has a role, sociology, cultural studies, legal studies, architecture, town planning. They all fit together, and the sort of language that people would often use to describe how they fit together would be a social ecological framework. So looking at the various layers of influence that surround you, and that could be the influence of your friends and family and people who are close to you, who obviously have a very big influence on you, but also the influence of how we design our cities and how we have a legal system and what our media discuss. All of those things shape us as well.
I studied psychology, a psychotherapy diploma, and I also have 20 years of meditation, understanding the mind. So I'm obviously very interested in that. And I know exactly what you mean, that when you walk down a street which is quiet and calm, it feels connecting. When I'm in next to our big, horrible main road called Morayfield Road, which I hate, I feel jagged and edgy. Even if I'm on the footpath, I still feel angry and aggressive, like I'm about to get the traffic. But if I go onto one of the side streets, the suburban streets, I end up in a much better frame of mind. It's clearly the infrastructure that is creating that. I came across your work a couple of different ways. I also saw that excellent video, I think it was Global Cycling Network, with you, and it just said, this is the car bias. I thought that is brilliant. I've put it up on our website. And then we had Marco de Brommelstraat on the show. He made reference about the work that you're hoping to do together in motonormativity, because not everybody will have seen that video. Perhaps you can describe some things in the infrastructure.
If I say very, very briefly what we mean by motonormativity, and then I can get into some of those examples. Motonormativity was a word we came up with to describe a shared mindset or a shared blind spot that we all seem to have from having grown up in a world that is designed so that driving comes first. What this does is it has an effect on everybody, that we become unable to see the harms of motoring in the way that we would with anything else. Whereas we're very good at saying operating a dangerous machine in public is a problem, we don't apply that same standard to operating a car in public, even though both of them are dangerous machines. And we've demonstrated experimentally that if you change a word from dangerous machine to car, or car fumes to cigarette fumes and so on, as soon as you mention cars, people's standards just shift completely. completely. So we first demonstrated that a couple of years ago in the paper that GCN made that video based on. And then interestingly, since then, 2 other researchers have replicated that. So a British team found the same thing in another sample of British people. An American researcher, Tara Goddard, found the same over in America. And then Marco and I have just done another study where we did 3 nations at once. So we looked at this. We no longer needed to replicate it again, because we know this happens. So we did a study that got much more into how and why it happens. We got much more into the mechanisms of it. So we used a sample from the Netherlands, the UK and the US, comparing across those potentially quite different cultures and environments, but not too different. Because obviously, if we were going really different, it would have been great to have China or somewhere like that. But we wanted kind of comparable Western cultures, but with quite different environments for transport. Compared those nations and really try to pick apart some of the elements of how is this mindset being shaped by the environment. And to cut a long story short, we found there's at least 2 separate things going on. There's separate pathways. So if you separate out what people explicitly say, if you ask them up front, do cars come first? Or, do you think driving is more important than not driving? Then that answer is predicted by a bunch of stuff, like which country do you live in? Do you live in the city or the suburbs or rural areas? All of these things have an effect. And then separately, you can also measure that tendency to show double standards. Now, obviously, those 2 things are fairly related. What you think explicitly is fairly closely related to your tendency to show double standards that downplay the problems of driving. But there's also separate stuff going on. So, for example, which country you live in separately influences both of those. So it has an effect on what you think explicitly, and it has a separate effect on your tendency to show double standards.
So now I'm very curious. What is the difference? I know from my own experience, do you believe in XYZ? And they say, no, I don't. And then you go, so if we did something about XYZ, what do you think the main problem would be? Then you see, actually, oh yeah, it's ABC. So what did you find in your research? Are you allowed to share that yet?
I probably can't say too much because it is still under review and off with the journal. And this is in some ways the next step that needs done. We've not got into too much depth yet on how do you change this? Because in a sense, I think that's for policymakers to take that step, or for people working in public realm to take that step. The kind of things that we have said, and the thing we said in our earlier report on this, there's almost certainly something to be done. Wherever people are making transport-related decisions, they should say, would we make the same decision if this was any other domain? I'll try and think of a couple of examples off the top of my head. An interesting one is, let's say we're doing a campaign on pedestrian safety, and we say, okay, we're going to focus on pedestrians making themselves more visible to motorists, which I saw one just yesterday that did this. Wouldn't it be good if a policymaker said, okay, before we go live with this, are we happy with the general principle here, which is people who are the victims of violence in public spaces should take action to protect themselves and the perpetrators don't get any message? Because if you recast it into those more general terms, you might start to see there's a problem with what you're doing. Another one that I think about a lot is in the legal system. If somebody is taken to court for traffic offences, very, very likely everybody on that jury and the judge have committed traffic offences that morning, because we know that most drivers speed. Would we tolerate that in any other circumstance? If we again go more general, go a little bit more abstract and say, are we happy with the jury trying somebody when most of them have committed related offences recently? If it was burglary, theft or fraud or any of these things, we'd see the problem. But we're so inured to the harms of motoring, and we're so conditioned to see them as normal and inevitable, that we just miss this.
That's what I thought was so interesting about that video, which I thought was super amazing. I will include that in the show notes. I started to look at the infrastructure because I kept going, why do cars think that they are allowed to park in a driveway across a footpath? And I went, because the driveway is the priority here. It's not coloured differently for a footpath. It often is designed for cars, and then pedestrians are this afterthought. The thing things like the corners at the intersection, the radius at the intersection, how wide it is, how much extra you have to go. I looked at outside my place. I realized that the turning radius of the corner, obviously we think of an intersection as being a straight cross, but outside my place, because of the design vehicle, and that's a technical term for our person in the community, what the council does is it designs a street according to the biggest vehicle that regularly uses that space. That's the design vehicle. The corner is so wide and open, it actually is 10 meters from what would be a point. That's how much it curves. And that makes it really difficult for people with disabilities and prams. Then it gives such a strong sense of entitlement on how do you use the land. So I thought that was so interesting. Are there other examples that are easy for people if they don't maybe want to watch the video?
The road itself, which is perfectly wide enough for two-way traffic, and then the flared junction, which is 2 or 3 times wider, is very visible. And actually one thing you can't see on the video is across the way from where that was filmed was another side road which had a much more square turning, and vehicles are perfectly capable of going in and out of that one. Right there in the street, you can see there's no need for these massive flared things. In terms of other examples, another one which we do touch on in that video again was pedestrian crossings. I don't know if they're exactly the same in Australia, but all the ones I'm familiar with around the world tend to involve the pedestrian waiting for motorists. The pedestrian presses a button, has a lengthy period in purgatory to think about their sins, and then finally is enabled into the promised land by being allowed to cross the road. That's another really interesting one. That, along with flared junctions, all sorts of other things, who stops and waits for whom by default, they all make complete sense if you recognise that the decision process starts with an assumption that motoring is number one and most important and must not be disturbed unnecessarily. But that is an assumption, and it's one that we are going to have to question if we want to encourage more healthy active travel and discourage short distance urban driving. At the moment, the way everything is being run is if you're trying to do healthy active travel, you're trying to walk somewhere or cycle somewhere, it is constant friction. You are constantly being made to wait. You are constantly being made to pause or take deviations or circuitous routes. And if you go out into most Western cultures, you will notice that not a lot of people are walking. And almost certainly a big part of the reason for that is that they have been shown over and over again that they're not terribly welcome. In fact, if you look at our streets, they scream a message at us, which is get in a car. Now, no one's done that deliberately, and this is really important. This is why we talk about it as a cultural phenomenon. Nobody's done this deliberately, although, of course, there are certain industries that like us driving, but there isn't some grand plot. This has happened inadvertently as this has become normalised over generations of people, and to the point where it is seen as normal and proper that cars come first and that we ignore the harms of cars. And that was another big facet of what we argued when we talked about this concept of motonormativity. It's not only that people come to see driving and imposing fumes and danger onto other people as normal, which it clearly is, but they also see it as proper. We argue that's one of the reasons why it is so very hard to make change here, because people very intuitively, very unconsciously feel that you are challenging the fundamental basis of society, because they've learned through decades of exposure that cars must come first. And you go and look at all of those street design features and you go, yeah, it looks like they do.
That's very interesting. Just about pedestrian crossings, I think might wait 3 or 4 minutes often. And then we get 5 seconds of little green man. 5 seconds. A lot of cars then don't think that you are entitled to those 5 seconds. High numbers of pedestrian deaths at corners for exactly that reason. Just about convincing people. Christchurch in New Zealand, they put up a really well-connected bike lane everywhere. And they had to employ 8 comms people to deal with the public. And they had to not hold those events in person, only online, for personal safety. They had these massive debriefing sessions for staff because the community was so incredibly aggressive. I think, if you've got 3 generations of indoctrination going, the car is the best form of transport, even though it's not. If you don't have a car, you're a loser, which is not true. Then, of course, it's like, well, why would you do anything else? And I know I certainly, in my younger years thought everyone would drive, everyone should drive, you should have cars everywhere, why can't I do that? So I understand that way of thinking. So what are some ways that you can make people aware of perhaps the level of indoctrination that they've come to?
Just really briefly, something you said there is really, really important, which is the people who don't have a car. I'm not sure what the figure is in Australia. I don't know if you happen to know that. But over here, it's roughly about 25% of people. I was very interested to see something recently suggesting it might even be a little bit higher in America, which of course we think of as being the car capital of the world. They've potentially got more carlessness, for want of a better word, than even here. Now, if ever there was a forgotten minority in the world, that's the one. The people who do not have a car, because they are not factored into decisions. They're not being considered properly in planning. And again, when you've got that automatic unconscious assumption that, well, you just get in the car, if everyone who's doing the planning just has that as the first step of thinking, that group is going to be so marginalised. And of course, that's exactly what we see. In terms of what we do, the number one thing, the thing I keep coming back to, and this actually goes all the way back to what we said at the start of this about psychology versus systems and so on. I think if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I'd have probably said, we really need to persuade people to behave differently and so on. And I still think there's some element of that. I really wouldn't want to let the people driving around in utes and SUVs off the hook for their personal choices. But we've also got to think a bit bigger than that, and we've got to systemic change. Because why is it possible? Why is it even allowed to drive around in an SUV, imposing harm on people when you're only going 400 metres? And I'm thinking a little bit of my next door neighbour who drives 400 metres to work here. Why is that even permitted? And how can we have a system where that isn't tolerated or allowed for people who are perfectly capable of not doing that? And the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about this is, and don't overinterpret what I'm about to say, but it feels like there's a lot of similar properties to an addiction. The example I keep thinking is, it's a bit like if you knew somebody, if you had a friend who was over-reliant on painkillers. Painkillers are very useful and have a great job to do, but if your friend was over-reliant on them and it was causing harm, you'd say something. And I think it's very similar with our addiction to cars. They're very useful and they have a job to do, but if somebody's over-reliant on them and using them inappropriately and it's causing harm, why can't we say something? Why is it so difficult to say something? And so that's a very long way of saying that I think the number one thing we as a society need to be doing is to acknowledge there's a problem. Ideally, if our prime ministers and presidents were to say, actually, our relationship with motoring has gone too far. We have a problem. We are using them inappropriately, and we are allowing people to impose harm onto others against their will for their own benefit. Then if we acknowledge that, and if we truly believed it, the remediation would start to fall out quite naturally, I think. If people saw the world the way I see it when I leave my front door and see the bullying and the entitlement and the imposition of danger onto other people, forcing other people to endure pollution and harm and risk against their will, then the solutions would start to become visible very quickly. Until we acknowledge that we have a problem, until we are prepared as a culture to say, oh my God, look what we've become, I don't think we're going to make progress. And we're certainly not going to make progress just chipping away at little things here and there. It's going to need to be that high level, top level, what has happened to us. Until we have that realization, I think we're in trouble.
Just going back to the stats on how many people can't drive. So there's a range that I've heard. You said, I think, 25%?
In the UK, it's about that, yeah.
So I'm surprised it's as low as that. In the US, Anna Zivitz from Disability Rights Advocate, America Walks, say 30%. Because once you start including people with disabilities, and then there are kids, and then there are seniors. In the US, in Portland, there's somebody called Kathy Tuttle. She says 40%. Sarah Stace, who's the CEO of a company involved in all this sort of stuff, she says 38% based on age, ability, finance. Here in Caboolture, where we are, we have a social disadvantage score of 2, which means that 98% of people in this council, it's one of the largest in Australia, Moreton Bay, have better social advantage than we do. What that means is we have high numbers of people who are low income, on disability, seniors, kids. I think it's more like 4 in 10 people, and maybe even more than 4 in 10 people. Getting the stats on that is really, really hard. You also have people who break their arm, break their foot, maybe on medications for a couple of months. That's quite a lot of people.
If I can just jump on that really quickly, you're talking about the broken arm or broken leg made me think about this, because that's something colleagues and I have spoken about quite a lot over the years, a little bit to what we were saying a few minutes ago. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that people have become unimodal in their travel, and that's problematic for all sorts of reasons. It's problematic because they default to the car, but also for them and for society. If you only know or only have one way to travel, you've no resilience. There's no flexibility there. You can't handle change. And a society that over relies on the car is not a resilient society. What would be lovely is the more we can have people become multimodal travellers, mindful multimodal travellers, people who've got a menu of options in their heads and they can say, okay, where am I going? What's the most appropriate way for me to get there today? Bearing in mind other goals like weather, who I'm travelling with, what I'm carrying. Ideally, we should think about all of those things and then pick the best mode of transport based on all of those considerations, which is certainly how I and everyone I know in the transport sphere thinks like this. And everyone I know in the transport sphere has a detailed backup plan for what happens if they break a leg. How many members of the public have that backup plan? How many of them have any resilience versus just habitually defaulting to the car? And so I think there's a real sense in which this tendency just to default to the car isn't working for the people themselves a lot of the time, because they've painted themselves into a corner and they've no options and certainly have no resilience in the face of changing circumstances.
I wondered if a model similar to cars is plastic. It's very useful. It is absolutely ubiquitous to our environment, our culture. We completely take it for granted. It's on kind of everything. How do you get away from a society which is so dependent on this thing which is ubiquitous?
The plastic analogy is a really interesting one, and I'll think more about that. Both of those industries, the sort of car stroke fossil fuel industry on the one hand and the plastic stroke fossil fuel industry on the other hand, spot the common link. It'd be very interesting to work out how much subsidy all of those get in order to keep us dependent on cars and plastic respectively.
When you create a society which has got transport poverty, which is where you are absolutely dependent on a car, then it creates a lot of social isolation. One of the banks during the pandemic put out some social isolation cost. Banks, they will obviously want a dollar value on that. And they put it at $1,500 per person per year. And so I converted all those statistics for this area, and it's $60 million a year in economic burden in social isolation. More gambling, more medical bills, more unemployment, more dependence on welfare. One of the big things is that here, being so transport dependent and also with low income, what you end up is people who have sort of modest means are forced to spend $10,000 a car per year, so $20,000 to $30,000 every year. And a cost people often miss is depreciation.
I thought was really interesting was this people having to spend $10,000 on a car. If that is a necessary cost, if you cannot partake in society without handing that kind of money over, we really probably should be thinking of that as a tax. It's an involuntary payment that you are being forced to hand over to partake in society. But it's the worst of all taxes because it's one we don't think of as a tax, and it goes to private businesses rather than to government for the benefit of the public. So that's something I think we could reframe quite usefully.
We had Graham Curry, who's a professor down at Monash, on the show, and he said one of the things that they now do in schools is they take the children out on public transport to use public transport for the first time so they can learn, because they're all driven to school.
The thing you mentioned about the children being shown how to catch the bus made me think of another element of motonormativity. Again, another really interesting double standard. So I was at a conference presentation quite a while ago now, where somebody quite legitimately was talking about how a lot of members of the public just do not know how to catch a bus. And they were doing an intervention where they were teaching people such basic things as, this is where you stand, this is what will happen when the bus comes, and you hold your hand out, and things that to some people seem incredibly basic, but needed to be said. And I think it was really important that they were doing it. But I think that highlights another really interesting double standard, that a lot of people look at public transport and say, oh, this looks like far too much effort. Oh, yeah, I don't have time to learn how to do this. I don't have time to engage with this. And they completely fail to remember the multiple lessons they paid for in order to learn how to drive a car. If you were to do it from scratch, it's one of those things where you say, imagine cars didn't exist and we just invented them. And people say, hang on, what? I'm meant to spend like 30 weeks paying paying somebody to teach me how to use this thing. No, it's far too complicated. Who's got time for that? Whereas we just swallow this need for detailed education and see it as an inevitability again. But we won't spend 20 minutes learning how to catch public transport.
We're heading up to the end of time. If our listener is a community member, maybe a mum at home stuck with a couple of kids, that's my friend, by the way, she's in a very car dependent area. She loves to ride her bike if she could get out there, but she's got this massive state road which goes at 100 kilometers an hour. So she's in a small little cul-de-sac area, and then she goes out and it's like she's actually very scared to go out because they drive so quickly. So what could someone like her or somebody else in the community do to raise awareness about this?
There's probably a lot of things they could do. There's also a lot of things they can't do, which is really important. What I'm about to say is easier said than done. And I think the reasons why this is not easy are also interesting. But potentially one of the strongest, most useful things she could do is speak to her local politicians, speak to her councillors and say to them, what are you doing to enable me to have a great life in this area without a car? And I think that's a challenge that politicians need more. What are you doing so that my life can be fulfilling and I can get my needs met without handing all this money over to car and oil companies?
I'm going to put that on my website. I think that is the best question. So I'm going to put it up as a poster in my room.
What she really needs to do is change the basis of Western society or something like that.
She has some moments where I feel she wants to do that. So if our listener is, say, in the transport team at council, maybe in a senior role or is a road engineer, what could you suggest?
I think probably one of the most important things is this business of saying, do we have a problem? Acknowledging that there is a problem, of recognising that every journey made in a car represents to some extent a failure of policy. There's always going to be a small subset of journeys that have to be done by a car because it's not feasible to build railways everywhere and things like this. But it should be minimised, and it certainly shouldn't be the starting point for journeys. It should be the last resort for any given journey out of people's mental menu of options. So the people in the council need to be giving the public this menu of options that the public can then work through, sometimes landing on the car as the last option, but it shouldn't be the first option each time. And that's what the local authorities need to be really aiming towards, I think.
That's really good, because I definitely feel that it is the default. I mean, we have had 3 generations, 100 years of indoctrination that the car is king. So that is definitely true. And it is really hard. It's like learning a new language of how to be in the world in a way.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if you speak any other languages. You said you had basic Welsh.
Very basic Welsh. I speak a bit of German and French as well.
Okay. But you know, when you go to those other countries and you see exactly the same thing and you read something and your mind sees the world in a different way because of that language influenced the way that we are. And I think in a way what you're saying is this is a new language that we need to learn at a cultural level for the same place that we are in now. That's very good.
And I'll give you a quick example. You earlier, I'm going to call you out on it, used a phrase like cars come and drive round and cars do this and cars do that. And I do it. We all fall into this. And it's such an illustration of that even you and I who are worried about the problems here, it's so easy for us to slip in the language of, oh, you know, a car has done this, a car has done that. Just excused a human being who'd made these choices. And that's just how endemic it is in our culture.
Yeah, totally indoctrinated. We're going to close out, but before we do, anything else that you would like to share or closing thoughts, remarks?
It's easier said than done, but the more people can get used to reframing all of the questions into other areas, the better, or making all of the questions more general. Next time you're thinking about how much you want to drive, think about whether you'd be equally happy if you wanted to do any other action. I know it's easy to take this too far, but dwell on what we said about the properties that feel a little bit like an addiction. Why do you go to it automatically? Why do you get so upset if somebody questions any element of you doing this? Why do you feel so challenged if somebody says maybe pedestrians should come first and drivers should wait? Why did those things scare you so much? Let's question those things a bit and look at ourselves, because that might tell us something about the system that's shaping us without our realising it.
I did try your thing just casually with a couple of people. I'd start by going, oh, if somebody smokes in in a place where they're not allowed to, what do you think? Oh, no, that's really bad. Okay, if somebody parks in a place where they're not allowed to, what do you think? Oh, well, they probably should. And you can hear the leniency.
Or they had a good reason. Yeah.
It's such a good way of inviting the question. I love these conversations that are so different and open and make me think how I'm indoctrinated like cars or being wrong. It's my favorite thing. So thank you very much for your time and for coming on the show. It's really very appreciated.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.